Today's presentation is Exploring Michigan's Wetlands with Michigan Natural Features Inventory, presented by Jesse Lincoln. Jesse is a conservation scientist slash plant ecologist with MNFI, extremely knowledgeable individual. If you get a chance to rub elbows with Jesse out in the field, I highly encourage you to take it. And in addition to all that, he's one of the most genuine folks I've had the pleasure of meeting. So he's just a really great person. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. Take it away, man.
Thank you for that introduction, Tony. I really appreciate that. Let me get my screen going here. All right, how we doing?
It is loading up. It looks like it's still black for us right now. Oh, there we go. I see your presentation.
All right. Seems like there might be a delay. I'll keep my video on. Just let me know if I need to turn it off. I love wetlands. I'm really excited to be here. When Tony asked me, I was happy to do it. And I also noticed you had quite a long list of impressive speakers, including one of my early mentors and the person that hired me as a seasonal, Mike Cost, who in 2022 gave pretty much a master class in natural communities. So I encourage you to check that out. And I wanted to take a bit of a different tack with it because he covered so much, and so this is really going to focus on sort of, I guess, what goes on in my head when I come across these wetlands. The early sort of portion will be a little bit sort of technical, kind of how to classify wetlands, how to rank them. And then I go into some of my favorite wetlands over the past 2 years. And so, yeah, it's hopefully going to be really enjoyable. Almost all these pictures are mine. I have a couple that are from other people, but almost all these are mine over the, course of my now 14-year career. So I really hope you enjoy it. Now it's not advancing, and there. At MNFI, Michigan Natural Features Inventory, we spend a lot of time in wetlands, from documenting rare plants and natural communities to looking for snails. In this case, Ashley Colwick, our zoologist, is looking for these tiny land snails, to looking for rattlesnakes with UMAN. We do get to spend a lot of time in wetlands, and it leads to some pretty stinky situations. I often wonder what people must think as they pass our cars in these hotel parking lots. But our mission is to guide the conservation of Michigan's biodiversity by providing the highest quality scientific expertise and information. And we develop and deliver critical knowledge to a broad array of end users to provide awareness and literacy about Michigan's biodiversity and foster the conservation and stewardship of Michigan's natural heritage, all for the common good. And we do that through maintaining this database. We have these ecologists, zoologists, botanists, planners, and GIS specialists, and we maintain this database. So these are locational sets of information for all the rare plants and animals and high quality natural communities. We maintain it through surveys and inventories. We conduct research, monitoring, and modeling. We participate in conservation planning and conservation education. And our database kind of looks like this. I call it the treasure map, where we sort of have all these little polygons of different natural communities mapped out across the state. And then we provide that locational information to different conservation partners. We're also part of a broader group. This is NatureServe. So this is an international organization. Every state has a heritage program, every province in Canada, and then several countries in the Western Hemisphere also have these heritage programs where we track all these rare species and important places. For the United States, we provide this map kind of showing biodiversity hotspots. And one of the aspects of Nature Serve that I'm most interested in is this national vegetation classification. So we've got all the sort of classes of vegetation sort of described across the country. And then for Michigan, we have all of our unique natural communities uh, described through our own state classification. And that's available on our website. Every single natural community type. We have, I think, 81 now. We have 3 new ones. Every natural community type has a profile page on our site where we describe kind of overview, and then all the way down to landscape context, soils, and then species lists for these communities. We also have global ranks, so that's part of the advantage of being part of this international organization. We're not just looking at the state context, but we look at global ranks. So G1 being critically imperiled, maybe only 5 or fewer occurrences. And so something like that is going to be our Lake Plain prairies or Lake Plain oak openings, all the way down to G5. So, secure. And even though it might be secure across its range globally, it might still be rare in our state as like a edge of range type thing. We have state ranks, so from S5 secure to S1, our most imperiled, fewer than 5 occurrences. And all this is kind of laid out in this field guide to the natural communities of Michigan. We're actually it's the 10th anniversary, and we're coming out with a new edition of that. We're working on it right now, so it's really exciting. New photos, new natural communities, and I'm really excited to be part of that work. So look for that to come out next year. So real quick, what is a natural community? It's an assemblage of interacting plants, animals, and other organisms that repeatedly occurs under similar environmental conditions across the landscape, and is predominantly structured by natural processes rather than modern anthropogenic disturbances. And it's worth including this ecological acknowledgement. Historically, indigenous peoples were an integral part of Michigan's natural communities. Many community types were dependent on native management practices such as cultural fire, wildlife management, and harvesting of plant materials. Their interactions were widespread, sophisticated, and central to maintaining historic abundances of biodiversity. Indigenous peoples and their cultural practices were and are integral parts of the natural ecosystems that we strive to protect. And we've expanded our definition of natural communities to recognize this fact. So, natural community classification, essentially we're saying, what is this? How many are there? How do we talk about it? We're dividing the complex natural landscape of Michigan into easily understood and describable components called natural communities. This community classification creates a common language about an area's native biodiversity and ecological context. Now, when we're out documenting these natural communities, we're essentially ranking them, and we're trying to understand where they fit on the sort of statewide map. Like, is this the best example of the community, or is it kind of in bad shape? When we rank, we're combining size, condition, and as part of condition, we're looking at anthropogenic disturbance, invasive species, and then we also look at landscape rank. And so we combine all these ranks to create an overall rank. And that is, we give the overall rank A through D. As we're describing these, we look at vegetation, so canopy, composition and structure. We're looking at tree size and age. We look at understory and shrubs. We look at herbaceous vegetation and variation across those strata. During this process, we also look at things like landform, soils, historic cover types. So we have these maps available, the circa 1800 maps that are based on notes from the original surveyors, and it's a really awesome resource. You can check that out on our website. Through documenting these natural communities, we look at ecological processes. So in this case, dry sand prairie, Why is it maintained as open structure? Because it has this depression, and it functions as a frost pocket during the growing season. So it slows that woody encroachment. So things like that. And then to kind of wrap it all up, we look at threats and management considerations. So this is a drone shot of a prairie opening that had ORVs just tear it up. And so you can see these ORV tracks in there, major threat. And then at the edge, you can see this, I think you can see my mouse. This is a burn line put in by the crew that was putting a prescribed fire down, and they put the plow line right in the prairie. And so we would want that moved back away from the edge of the prairie. We can I have you hold on? I got some people having a meeting right outside my office.
Hey guys.
Sorry about that. That was very distracting. So I wanted to give an example of how we use this classification system, how we use this assessment of natural communities, and how we put it in a report and share to partners. And this is the last report I came out with, a natural features inventory of the Pentwater State Game Area. And I'm going to take you kind of through from beginning to end. So our state game areas, it's about 400,000 acres in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula. And these are owned by the DNR, and they're managed by the Wildlife Division. And so all these green areas are game areas, and they're very important to the biodiversity of southern Michigan. And Pentwater State Game Area is right over here, right off of the coast of Lake Michigan. And what we do during this inventory process is we map every stand. And so you can see these are different covers. These are different cover types. Each one has a different composition. So we sort of map these based on sort of a uniform composition. So for example, this is a mixed emergent wetland. We list all the species in there, and then we describe their abundance. We also provide a sort of a sense of integrity through this eco score. So 5 out of 5, pretty great. And we give it a community, a natural community classification. So in this case, intermittent wetland, and then some basic notes. This is a high quality intermittent wetland, could be included in prescribed burns. There's a small patch of reed canary grass in the southern portion. And we do this for the whole game area. And we've done this for all game areas too. So MNFI, this was the first thing I was hired for. We do this vegetation mapping across game areas. Now we want to get to the point where we can come up with this report. So we survey the high quality natural communities, we look for rare species, and we document as many rare species as we can, and we include maps with the location information on where these rare species are found. And then we provide this to managers and sort of give a roadmap for prioritizing and managing these places based on the rare species and high quality natural communities there. I love the work. And so I wanted to take you through the process of, all right, you get to a spot, what is it? And so I've never seen this done. I'm going to walk through basically how to use the key for classifying the natural community. And I'm going to do it just on this one instance, and then I'll kind of get into the other aspects of assessing these communities. So what are we looking at here? Well, we got to start. A friend reminded me, you always have to start with physiography, right? We have to start with the sort of reason why the land is the way it is. And at a certain point of the glacial recession, all the outlets that we now think of for the Great Lakes were blocked, and this sort of elevated lake actually drained out through Chicago, and the area of Pentwater, Ludington, and the whole coastline was essentially underwater. And so we can look at LIDAR and we can actually see this. So this is essentially what the coastline was historically. You can see here, this is the Pentwater River where it cuts through, and this is the outwash channel, and this is Lake Michigan here. These are big dunes along the coast. These are the dunes along Silver Lake. And so that's where Pentwater State Game Area is. Zooming in, we can see these giant parabolic dunes along the lakeshore, so maybe 150 feet tall. But inland, we have these really interesting little dune fields. So what happened is it was underwater. The glaciers were melting, depositing sands along the shoreline. The lake levels dropped once once the lakes could drain. And then these sands were exposed and started marching and formed these really interesting dune fields. And we actually see a similar feature just north in Ludington. So these are the open dune fields of Ludington State Park, where you have these interdunal wetlands, these kind of open marching dunes. And then these interdunal wetlands are influenced by the levels of the Great Lakes. Here, in Pentwater, this is Pentwater. It has since become forested, but we still have these sort of pockets of wetlands where there were what I imagine were historically interdunal wetlands. So really interesting landscape context. You got to start there to really wrap your head around a site. Okay, now we get here. What community type is it? You have to go through the key, and I'm just going to take it from beginning to end, just through this one. But you start with 1A. Is it palustrine, a wetland or upland community, or relatively equal mixture of both? That's this top line. Or is it primary substrate, essentially bedrock, characterized by little to no soil development? Well, it's not that one. So we go with this, and then we go down to couplet 2A or B. Is it a wetland or terrestrial upland community? Or is it a relatively equal mixture of palustrine and terrestrial? Well, it's just a wetland. It's just wetland. So we can go to this. Is it a wetland or upland? And I know this is pedantic, but just going through the whole process, I promise this will be the most technical part of the whole presentation. All right, so moving on from there, is it an open, non-forested wetland, or is it a forested wetland? And obviously it's an open, non-forested wetland. And then, is it dominated by submergent vegetation? Well, there's a little bit of that, or emergent graminoid vegetation. So graminoid being grass-like, so sedges, rushes, grasses, things like that, with inundated to saturated or mineral soils. Or is it dominated by graminoids and forbs with low shrubs, stunted conifers, and brown mosses or sphagnum mosses? Nope, not seeing those. This has mineral soils, just a tiny bit of moss at the top, but really essentially sands right at the surface. What they're looking for here is if you see actual peat development, right? Because that'll take you to bogs, muskegs, and fens. And this just is not that. We don't have this kind of real substantial peat development here. So we're going to go here. And so that takes us to 3A or 3B. Is it dominated by submergent vegetation and or emergent graminoid vegetation? Or is it dominated by grasses with sedges? And the thing here, this is a little ambiguous to me, but I know it's not a prairie, and we had those zones of submergent vegetation. We're going to go to marsh. And within that, is there standing water throughout the growing season? And really, if you looked at the majority of this, there was a little bit of standing water over here, but the majority of it was not standing water throughout the growing season. That takes us to 7A. Now, we got a split here. This one, is the soil saturated by sodium and chloride laden groundwater? How would you possibly know that, right? Well, you could look at some indicator plants, but also, I mean, you get to the point where you realize there's just only one inland salt marsh left. They've all been destroyed, and there's only one case. So unless you're in Maple River State Game Area, it's not an inland salt marsh. So we go down 7B, and kind of taking us down to here. The split comes down to, is it a coastal plain marsh or an intermittent wetland? And really, the things we end up having to look at is the wetland dominated by these Atlantic and Gulf coastal plain disjunct plants or not? And what does that even mean, Jesse? Well, this is Bonap Botany of North America, and it has the locational information for everywhere any plant in North America has been documented. And so the green means it's present in that state. The dark green means it's present in that state. The light green means it's been documented from that county. And the yellow means it's considered rare in that state and has been documented in that county, right? So not rare in Texas, but found here, considered rare in Louisiana, rare in Missouri, and rare in Michigan. But if you look, the main distribution for whatever species this is, it doesn't matter, shows this coastal plain sort of epicenter with this disjunct population around Michigan. And so there are several species in Michigan, all mostly concentrated right here along the Southwest Michigan. And there are several species that dominate wetlands. And so those are called coastal plain marshes, if they have that prevalence of these disjuncts. And I know it's a little specific, but I find it super interesting. And so you're just going to have to suffer through it. So this wetland we were looking at dominated by several species, but one of the prevalent ones was Carex vesicaria. Here's its distribution. Nope, not a coastal plain disjunct. Eleochris elliptica, not a coastal plain disjunct. Calamagrostis canadensis, not a coastal plain disjunct, right? So this classification really often relies on a deep familiarity with our flora. And I find that to be really just honestly kind of delicious. It's just really wonderful to get to know it all so well. Now, I did find a couple of these, and what we have is Rexia virginica. And that kind of does have a coastal plain distribution. Well, so now what, Jesse? And if you look at the key Atlantic for intermittent wetlands, Atlantic and Gulf coastal plain disjuncts are absent, rare, or limited in number. And that's what we had. It was just that one. And so I'm going intermittent wetland. All right. Now we can kind of look at our classification. We can read up the profile on intermittent wetlands and get a real sense of what we're looking at here. So the global rank, it's actually been changed to G3. So vulnerable, not imperiled, and the state rank is S3. So they're not common, but they're not like the rarest of the rare. Through this process, now we know what it is, intermittent wetland. Now I take a full species list. We go and describe, walk a representative transect through this whole thing, write down every species we see, try to capture abundances and things like that. And this is my favorite part of the job. Now, I am sort of going through that natural community key every time I'm in a natural community, but you just get such a familiarity. You don't need to get those initial steps, and it's usually down to just one or two community types, and it's fairly easy to figure out after a while, and after you've had enough kind of experience looking at these things. One of the cool things we found here was this Potamogeton, and I'm admittedly very bad with this type of aquatic vegetation, but this sort of thin Potamogeton here was Potamogeton bicupulatus and waterthread pondweed, and it's threatened in Michigan. And interestingly, according to Michigan Flora, hasn't been documented in Oceana County prior to these surveys. So that's a nice little feather in the cap. We compile these detailed species lists, and one of the things to notice is this coefficient of conservatism, the C values, and we really like to see these tens. So the C value is on a range from 0 to 10, with 0 and 1 being kind of a ditchweed, it'll grow anywhere, and a 10 showing a real fidelity to the highest quality sites. So we like to see those 10s, 9s, 8s, and 7s. That is an indicator of these, an intact community. We only had one non-native species, reed canary grass, and we plugged this all into the universal FQI. So it's a program that lets us kind of calculate a site's FQI, and that's floristic quality index. And it's just a sense of kind of where it stands on the from a statewide perspective. And anything 35 or higher is considered regionally significant for biodiversity conservation, and a 50 is like protect at all costs. It's sort of extremely important for biodiversity. So this is 34.5. It's awesome. That's a great score. And we factor that into the ranking. So we look at condition, we look at composition, anthropogenic disturbance, and invasive species when we're considering ranking. And this site had intact hydrology, that characteristic water fluctuations and zonations that sort of is emblematic of these intermittent wetlands. It's very diverse. There's a concentration of conservative species, so those 10s, 8s, and 9s. There are rare species here, and there is a tiny patch of reed canary grass, so that's a bit of a strike against it, but it's easily treated and it's extremely small. So I gave this for condition an A rank. And remember, the overall rank is a combination of condition, landscape rank, and size. So moving on to landscape, at Pentwater, we have a fairly large, relatively unfragmented block of public land. There are several high quality natural communities. There are some two tracks trails throughout the high quality natural communities, and there are ORV issues throughout. It's super close to Silver Lake, and a lot of ORV use gets directed there when Silver Lake is full, unfortunately. There are rural residences kind of peppered throughout the game area, so it's broken up in a couple places. And there are early successional forests just off screen here. So some clear cuts, things like that have kind of lowered the overall rank. There are also extreme deer densities, and it's amazing in some places, just the density of deer. There will be no herbaceous vegetation. And much of the area is fire adapted, but fire suppressed. I will say that we'd like to see more fire here, but the game area staff, the DNR, the Wildlife Division, has been doing a great job in including big blocks and prescribed fires. So it's really exciting to see the attention that this place is getting. So, but overall, giving it a rank, the landscape context, a rank of BC or good to fair. Finally, the size rank. Well, for intermittent wetlands, large is 40 acres or more, moderate is 20 to 39 acres, small is 5 to 19, and very small is under 5 acres. There are 45 examples of intermittent wetlands as of 2024, and the average size is 44 acres, and the median size is 26. So at 7.7 acres, it's pretty firmly C rank, so small. Putting it all together, condition A, landscape BC, size C, the overall rank, I gave it a B. And that's good. And I'm pretty happy with that. Honestly, this is on par with some of the intermittent wetlands in some of the more remote parts of the UP. These were extremely diverse for the community type, and they were in great shape. So I was excited with a B. It's hard to get much higher ranked natural communities in southern Michigan, especially with such fragmented landscapes. So moving on to another nearby natural community type that, I mean, let's be honest, looks the same, but these grasses are big blue stem, Calamagrostis canadensis, and spartina, so prairie cordgrass. So we have it looks similar, and it's kind of in the same landscape context, but totally different composition. And in the classification, it comes down to, what specific grasses are they? Big blue, we have blue joint and cordgrass as the dominants. That puts us at a wet music sand prairie. And so these are S2 imperiled. So they're actually 20 examples. fewer than half as many as the intermittent wetlands, and globally they're much more rare than intermittent wetlands. So these prairie types are really fascinating. And we already went through the classification and how to rank these things. These were ranked as a BC. So I'm kind of going to just skip to threats and management recommendations because these are a little bit more involved. These need a little bit more attention than those intermittent wetlands. I showed the shot earlier. One of these openings, the biggest, most diverse opening, had been just blasted by these ORVs. They really tore it up. And then after we had recommend they put prescribed fire down, unfortunately, they put the fire break right at the ecotone, sort of that transition from the wetland to the upland, and only burned inside this fire line. And if you think about it historically, these wetlands would have burned in concert with the surrounding uplands. And these surrounding uplands are amazing. And so I know this is a wetlands talk, but suffer through this. These are 300-year-old white oak. They're some of the oldest white oak I've seen in the lower peninsula, well, just some of the oldest white oak I've seen in Michigan. But fascinatingly, you have these old red pine in there too. And red pine and white oak are both extremely fire adapted species. Red pine requires fire to regenerate. And I took my kid out on a survey looking for these fire scarred red pine. So these red pine have thick bark and they can withstand fire. And interestingly, the way they heal actually creates these fire scars, and you can see individual fires within this. So these trees actually record how many fires they've been through. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fires on the stump, or on this living tree. And we can find stumps that were taken in the 1800s, and this red pine, Pinus resinosa, basically creates this so almost like epoxy. It pumps its response, pumps this sap through it, and it actually preserves it. So a lot of the stumps that are left on the landscape from the first logging era are red pine, and they record the fires. It's amazing. And what's also fascinating, well, here, zooming in, you can see here's a fire scar. Here's another one. There's another one. There's another one here. It kind of got broken up there. And then here's another one. And so this is from Pentwater, and you can count the growth rings between these scars to determine a site's unique fire history. So 5 years between fires, 6 years, 8, and these are all in the early 1800s. Now, lightning strike isn't that frequent. And so through this process, we can kind of understand that these were potentially fires that were put down by indigenous people. And we can also use this as sort of a roadmap to how to manage it. Eventually, we hope to be able to kind of figure out what season these fires were put down, and we can then work with local managers to kind of replicate this to manage these systems in a more holistic way. So hopefully, we're going to start burning these wetlands, these prairies, in concert with these adjacent uplands at a relatively high frequency. And what I'd like to see is, like, you can see these big white oaks at the edge. Those were grown in more open conditions. In the absence of fire, the ecotone has been kind of getting eaten up as the forest expands into the wetland, into the opening. And so over time, we hope to be able to push this back. Now, in terms of specific recommendations, we urge them to redirect and eliminate trails. Or they can configure trails to be as far from the openings as possible, and they can use them to serve as burn breaks to maximize the size of the burn unit and prevent additional burn breaks being added to the landscape. We want to minimize that type of disturbance as much as possible. We suggested they treat reed canary grass and continually monitor for invasive species, continue applying prescribed burns, and including the prairie openings and as much of the surrounding forest as possible. Avoid the use of equipment in the ecotone transition between the prairie and the forest, and implement low intensity, low severity, late season burns at a frequency of approximately every 5 to 10 years. Finally, the last wetland that I want to talk about in Pentwater is the Great Lakes Marsh. This is a beautiful spot. This is the east end of Pentwater Lake. So this is where the Pentwater River is joined by the north branch of the Pentwater River, and then it flows out into Pentwater Lake and then off into Lake Michigan. And it looks beautiful, but the majority of this is this narrowleaf cattail. So what happened was in the increased water levels of the late 2010s, so like 2015 through 2020, there were extremely elevated water levels here. And so this all got flooded. And when it went down, it was taken over by this invasive cattail. So these light green areas are still the native vegetation. You have native vegetation back here, but these sort of darker green, that's all non-native cattail. And when this was first documented in 89, it had an overall rank of BC, and now it's overwhelmingly dominated by cattail. I changed the rank to D. And so it's hard to know how to manage this. Do we invest in herbicide control? I mean, that's insane amount of herbicide with so much collateral damage. And would it even really change anything? There was a causeway put here in the early part of the 20th century. Is that influencing how water moves through here? There's frog bit in here, there's milfoil in the lake, but it's still a really important place for spawning fish and migratory waterfowl. So trying to put that all in context. Also, here's a shot from Google Earth. If you look, here's the Pentwater River, and there's a ton of agriculture that is right at the edge of this sort of riparian corridor. So it seems like there's a ton of nutrient runoff, and without changing any of these sort of practices, like creating maybe additional buffers, are we really even going to be able to, even if we get rid of all the cattail, is it just a matter of time before it totally comes back, because we have the sort of same degrading inputs? So try to frame all that in these reports, and you can check it out on our website. I just finished it, spent 6 weeks on it with a lot of other conservation scientists, so it's fresh on my mind, which made it really easy to use as an example to talk about. But how does all this relate to water quality in Pentwater Lake? How does this relate to water quality along the beaches? How does it factor into being an important biodiversity corridor when there's tons of shoreline development? And we try to fit all that, at least mention all that in these reports. So there's a lot there, but it's really fascinating. I love it. And we've done it for a lot of different areas too. So I wanted to switch from sort of like a more technical but practical approach to documenting wetlands and natural communities to some of the more fun examples. And so in 2023, our lead ecologist and I, Josh Cohen, surveyed Grand Island. And we did this as part of a project to describe the natural communities on Lake Superior Islands. A lot of them, are on protected lands. So this is owned by the U.S. Forest Service. And so, they've been presumed to be sort of protected, and, nothing more needs to be done. But these islands have some really unique natural communities, very important biodiversity, and they're just such an emblem of the Great Lakes. And so we really pushed for this project. It was supported by the EPA, Eagle, Matt Pricer, and Eagle was a big supporter of this. And so we just finished year 2 of the 3-year project. And this year 1, we went to Grand Island, Rabbit Island, and Manitou off the Keweenaw. And Grand Island was honestly a highlight of my career. I loved it so much. And we wrote this report. I love this report. We spent weeks crafting it, so you can check it out on our website too. So Grand Island is here, right off of Munising and on the south shore of Lake Superior. And this is an elevation map, and it's got some wild topography. It's extraordinary. It's sort of the western end of the Pictured Rocks Formation. So you have these 200-foot sandstone cliffs, particularly on the north and west end. There is still some old growth forest on there, Music Northern Forest. They started logging it in the 60s and finished up in the 90s, but there are patches of old growth Music Northern Forest that remain. Really incredible 300 to 400-year-old hemlock. That's probably almost a 4-foot diameter hemlock. It was unbelievable. These places were incredible. But the cliffs are really the story. I mean, it's just, I could talk about Grand Island for just an obnoxious amount of time. But the area I really wanted to focus on was here. It's such a bizarre formation. They call this a tombolo. So when lake levels were higher, these were actually at least 2 separate islands. So this was all underwater. This was one island. They call this the thumb, and then this was another island. Now, currents going through here slowed and deposited sands. So you had eventually this buildup of the sandbar. And then when the lake levels dropped, the sandbar was exposed. It's called a tombolo, and it is magical. There's just an incredible old growth pine forest on there. So these are old growth red pines. You just don't see structure like this on these super canopy red pines almost anywhere. So this is, large diameter lateral branching, very complex kind of structure with canopy deadwood. Really lovely stuff. Aged in at, some were about 350 years old. So just a really special concentration of old growth trees. Again, with these fire scars indicating indigenous cultural fires. So at least 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 fires here. And there was a known village for, I think, 3,000 years right on this tombolo, and that was present up until the mid 1800s. So recent cultural activity there. Really special place. Now, there was a natural community mapped here before we started doing this work, and we saw it's the white line here on the tombolo, and this was all mapped as a Great Lakes marsh. And so right away we kind of were looking at it sideways, like, man, that needs to be updated. So this was already a target. We needed to refine the boundaries. So this white boundary is what it was from 1989, and the yellow boundary is where we ended up with the sort of extent of the Great Lakes marsh. Now, 1989, we didn't have this incredible technology, and our ecologist at the time famously was given like $700 to document Great Lakes marshes around the state. So no budget, and there also, I don't think, was a ferry running at the time, and so this is one of the most legendary stories in the MNFI. Denny Albert he windsurfed from the mainland to survey this Great Lakes marsh, and then he hiked all the way to the north part of the island and found a patch of old growth forest and documented that, and then made it back and windsurfed and almost died because the storm came up. And I don't know, I just love that story so much, because I would never ever do that. And so then it was mapped on digital maps, and then it was transferred over. It was mapped on paper maps, and then eventually it was digitized. So were these boundaries kind of messed up in that digitization process? Who knows? But it was clear that this is a forest. It's not a Great Lakes marsh, and something needed to be done. So this was an early target. One of the things right away, while we were doing our prep work, it became clear we had this really interesting patterning forming on the tombolo. And so that is sort of a characteristic pattern of wooded dune and swale complex. So this is Bay de Gris up off the Keweenaw Peninsula. And I took this picture from an airplane, and you can see sort of these bands. And what these are sort of like bathtub rings. When the ice from the glacier was on our continent, it had depressed the continent so much. In some places, it was depressed over 1,000 feet. While the glaciers melt and the continent begins to spring up. And sometimes that happens gradually, but sometimes in certain areas, just because of the shape of the land, it happens in a little bit more of a punctuated way. So the glacier melts, the land pops up, the beach is exposed, and then some of that sand gets blown up and forms this little dune ridge. And then it happens again. So you get this sort of these parallel ridges that are forming because of this isostatic rebound thousands of years ago. And it's just a fascinating process. Well, that played out here on this Tombolo. So you had these clear ridges forming, and that is a distinct community type called the wooded dune and swale complex. And it's basically a Great Lakes endemic community type. Really fascinating. And that sort of geomorphology drives a lot of the diversity here, because you go from sort of having these poor fens, eventually they become shrubbed into this northern shrub thicket. Here you have like essentially a northern a hardwood conifer swamp, and by the end or towards the north end of it, it ends up being a dry northern forest. So you get this range from wet open, from open wetlands all the way to the driest forest community types. Really fascinating. So this everything you can see was mapped as Great Lakes marsh initially from this 1988 survey. And it clearly needed updating. Well, how did we, what was the result? This is where the Great Lakes marsh was. This ended up being poor fen. So northern fen, coastal fens, poor fens, what's the difference? In this case, it's slightly acidic, right? So most fens are alkaline, but this is slightly acidic, but not as acidic as a bog. So you have this poor fen here. Here, this is the boundary between upland and wetland. You have poor conifer swamp, so dominated by tamarack and black spruce. This is Mesic northern forest, old growth, hemlock, and white pine. And then here you have the beginning of your wooded dune and swale complex. So just another example of how we manage our database, how we have to sort of think about these things, and how like there's always kind of this approach to improving our classification and how we maintain our database. So I love that example. And I love Grand Island. I loved it. It was really just an exceptional place. We were basically given the red carpet treatment from the Forest Service, and it was some of the most incredible surveys of my life. And again, I'm really proud of the writing we did. We spent weeks and weeks crafting this because it's so complicated. Like, how do you talk about everything I just said in a competent and coherent approach that also, is interesting to read? And hopefully we did that. Okay. I want to, this project, this Lake Superior Islands project has been magical. And I want to end with my favorite surveys of 2024, but also honestly the best surveys of my life. It was so incredible. We spent, I think we were gone 19 days total, but 16 days on Isle Royale itself. And the target here are these volcanic bedrock natural communities, right? So the volcanic bedrock lakeshore communities are some of the rarest, certainly in the state and in North America. Very unique. So beautiful. The geology here is fascinating. So this is from Schatzel's Geography and Geology of Michigan. A long time ago, there was this upwelling from the center of the earth that pushed up sort of like a pimple, kind of like this, kind of like how we think of Yellowstone, right? We have this hot spot that pushed up, and there were all these lava flows about 1 billion years ago, I think. I'm an ecologist. I do my best with this, but it's very complicated. That current moved. And so it sort of like pushed up while there was this pressure from below. And somehow that current in the magma moved and it collapsed. So you had this dome sort of collapse and then kind of became inverted. And the way it inverted created these sort of flows now that were at the surface of the earth. And so each band is a distinct lava flow. And it's essentially a mirror image on the Keweenaw. So as it inverted, it's all part of the same formation that kind of comes up like a bowl. And so I think I'm doing an okay job explaining it. So at the north side, you have Isle Royal, and it dips down, and at the south side you have the Keweenaw Peninsula. So that there are these sort of like sister formations, I guess. It's awesome. And that's why it's volcanic, because it's lava and not granite, which is so much of the rest of this part of North America. Like Marquette, that's all granite. So those are sort of internal. It was never lava on the surface. It's all internal. The whole Canadian side, all granite. A lot of Ontario, Minnesota, granite. So we spent a lot of time interpreting aerial imagery and trying to find out where we would focus our surveys on these bedrock communities, because nobody from MNFI had documented these natural communities before. We had no existing documented natural communities. Now, tons of people have done work here. The National Park Service has their own classification, different universities. There's been a ton of amazing work done describing these, but none of it through this natural heritage methodology, none of it through NatureServe. And so we hadn't gone through sort of our standardized process for documenting, describing, and mapping these natural communities. And so that's what we were doing. We were documenting these bedrocks for the first time in our organization. Again, tons of great work. This isn't anything brand new, but it's new for our organization. And also it's a great chance to get some new shots for the upcoming re-release of the book. So you can see these from a long way away, and these are massive. These like 7 miles across maybe. So the whole island is 50 miles long, and some of these are just unbelievable. They don't look like much until you get out there. They're incredible. But these were our two biggest targets for this initial survey in 24, and these appeared to be volcanic bedrock glade, and that southern one, a lot of volcanic lakeshore. So this is Rock Harbor. This is where the ferry comes in, at least at the north end. And so there were camps here that we were planning on using. And so we did 5 days at each of these, or 5 nights at each of these. And then we would go back, take a ferry back to Rock Harbor, do some laundry, resupply our food, and then go to the next site. So this is me and Josh as we're doing these surveys. And it was, again, some of the best work of my career. And it was a lot of fun kind of following him around. So Josh Cohen, our lead ecologist. So our first hitch was Daisy Farm, 5 days here. So took a ferry from Rock Harbor to Daisy Farm, and then just do as many surveys as we can, go as far as we can over these 5 nights, covering ground with a real focus on the bedrock, because those are the rarest, right? So that's easy to prioritize. And then we go back for the next hitch. But what we found here were clearly the state's biggest and highest quality volcanic bedrock communities. Simply amazing, influenced by incredible elk herbivory. There are no white-tailed deer, so their herbaceous composition is very elevated compared to the communities on the mainland. And it's so hard to get to. There are so few trails that there are just almost no invasive species across most of these. Some of them were pretty abused, had a lot of invasive species, but for the most part, these were extensive, extraordinary examples of the community type. In this picture, we have, we're standing in a volcanic bedrock glade over a 100-foot volcanic cliff over, that's a poor fen, and then the background is just extensive high quality boreal forest. So just we were just treated to these incredible vistas. No trail here, we had to bushwhack to get here. These wetlands were spectacular. No invasive species, kind of operate on these extraordinary long cycles of beaver flooding, then wolf predation, eliminates the beaver. The wetland goes kind of in this incredible cycle from submergent, emergent vegetation, then into these poor fen systems, and then over several hundred years, eventually convert back into rich conifer swamp. And so you get to see these cycles play out in a way that you just don't get to on the mainland. And it's an absolute treat. So we're just basically scrambling from bedrock outcrop to bedrock outcrop, describing as much as we possibly can in between, and just having the time of our life doing it. So that was the first hitch at Daisy Farm. The second was Chippewa Harbor. And that, as you can see, is like the real story there is the glades, but the shoreline too. And so these shorelines were amazing, incredible. And this is probably the highest concentration of rare species I've encountered. It was just huge populations of things that I've only ever read about, because at least in Michigan, they only occur here. So there are a lot of, in the same way we had those coastal disjuncts in southern Michigan, where species associated with the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. Here, it's the opposite. You have species that occur in Alaska or in the tundra, and then their next population is 500, 1,000 miles away on Isle Royal. So you get these sort of northern and western disjuncts, and you have tons of them. And it's just so awesome. It's botanically overwhelming. It's physically draining, and it's just such an intellectual challenge all the time, because you're planning routes. You're trying to figure out just how much stamina you have, or I have, because I'm getting a little gray in the beard, getting a little old, and 12-hour days on this type of community are really exhausting. We did a lot of swimming to stay cool. Just like you have to drop your body temperatures, because you'll start like this in the morning and you'll be cold, and then the fog will lift off and you'll be hot, and the rock absorbs all this heat and kind of bakes you from below too. And so some days we'd swim 4 times just to keep our sanity. Isn't that amazing? Look at these cliffs. That orange is a lichen, I think orange starburst lichen. So it's fed by the guano of migratory birds. But the biggest volcanic glades around, simply stunning. So we spent a ton of time just trying to take pictures, describe all the variation. It was really special. I loved it. Now, you're here for wetlands. We had those 2 hitches, right? We had those 2 stints, 5 days each, and we had 2 nights remaining. We got back, we were staying at the national park dorms, doing laundry, stocking up, and we were trying to decide if we could, what are we going to do for the last 2 nights? And we could either kind of stay around here at the north end, and if we can't catch a boat somewhere, because the ferries don't really run past here, and there was a potential for waves, and we didn't want to get stranded and miss the boat back. So we're like, well, what are we going to do? There's plenty to do here, but we had always had our eye on this, from, if you do any aerial interpretation of the island, this area stands out pretty immediately. And what we see is this open, assuming a peatland. You've got some conifer swamp here, but these striations are really unusual. That's an indicator of a pretty special natural community type. So this is from Google Earth, and we predicted that this would be a patterned fen, right? And so this was always a priority for us, but it was just kind of, maybe we'll do it in 25. So patterned fen, it's a peatland, but they're characterized by these very strange patterns. So this is a drone shot I took over by the Straits of Mackinac, and you can see these sort of low areas, then these peat ridges throughout. And these are called flarks. So these low spots, they're flarks. They're more minerotropic. So they're kind of more in this flow of groundwater. They're more circumneutral. And then these are strings. And so you'll have mounding peat, and that peat, as it kind of mounds out of the sort of groundwater, it becomes slightly more acidic. So you get this gradient of pH, you get this gradient of moisture, and that really drives the not just the structure, but the composition floristically. So the flarks and strings, which are fun to say, but they actually differ dramatically in terms of vegetative composition. And these form perpendicular to the flow of groundwater. So you have groundwater flowing this way, and just something about that process, you get a slight shift in the sort of peak composition, and then over time that really dramatically reinforces, and then that dramatically reinforces the shifts in composition. Well, we were able to hitch a ride with these researchers for the Park Service. So these are 4-foot waves, and they're just super chill, eating breakfast, going on, and we're just, I get mildly seasick, so I'm just like sitting in the corner, just not saying much. But they were, it's just another day of the week for them. But we hitched a ride for our final 2 nights. They dropped us off at the far southwest end. This is Sisquit Bay. There's a little campground here. We set up camp. It was awesome. And this was our target. And they call it the Swamp of Sadness, just because it can be so awful to get to. So to get there, we had to do 3 miles along the trail. And then we left the trail and we bushwhacked for about 2.5 miles just to get there. And for a while, it wasn't too bad. There were a couple of moose trails that we followed, and then the trails just dropped off. And then once we hit the swamp, it was, not a nightmare, but it was the first time. So like, we're tired. This is 5 miles, and we're not even at the site, and we're not even through the worst part of the commute. And so by about here, we're like, do you think we're gonna make it? Do you think we're actually gonna get there? And we've never talked like that. Like, it's always like, of course we're gonna get there. But it felt like doubt started creeping in. We're tired from so many days of surveys. Like, we feel strong, but at the same time really weak and exhausted, and we definitely want to go home, and we definitely want to shower. But it's also like just building up this incredible anticipation. So, but we make it, and we spend, like 2.5, 3 hours in this incredible pattern fen. And then we hike up the backside of this cliff. So this is about a 400-foot cliff. And then, but there was like a little break, so we could make it up. And then we just picked up the trail and made it back. And it was sun up to sundown, and we were literally limping. We were just so exhausted. Our feet were sloshing, filled with water, and our feet were pruny, and like our legs hurt so much. We each had to eat 2 bags of the camp meal, each of which is apparently 2 servings. But it was one of the most incredible days of my career, and I really loved it. This is the Swamp of Sadness. This is what we had to bushwhack through. So much wind throw, all these storms off Lake Superior, kind of turning these swamps into these incredible knots of cedar, impassable. So it took us a very long time to get through there. But once we did, we were just treated to one of the most spectacular scenes. It was you get all this groundwater pushing through here. So all these trees are extremely stunted. This tree, I aged this tree. There's no reason for you to believe me, but it was 220 years old, and I've never seen anything remotely like that. These trees were essentially old growth, just stunted and gnarled. Very little moose herbivory, but some. And then you're surrounded by these incredible vistas. That's all cliff. We're surrounded by this cliff with old growth Mesic northern forest all over it, and then this incredible high quality rich conifer swamp at the edges. and just stunning diversity everywhere we went. It was just like billowing with this perfect assemblage of plants. And here we got the pattern, right? So here's a string, here's a flark. It's subtle, it's easier from a drone, but no drones on national parks. But we had the patterning, so it felt like a real success. We predicted it and it was there, and that's always nice. But it was just one of the most incredible days. And yeah, I think I feel like this shows kind of the full range of what it's like, from these wetland communities in southern Michigan all the way to the very best of the best. So that pattern fen was an A rank, in case you were wondering. And yeah, that's really all I have. And I don't know if there are questions or how you want to go from there, but it's really exciting work, and I hope that was a good cross section of it. So thank you.
Two questions currently, and if you have other questions, please use the Q&A feature to ask them, and we'll get to them. So the first one, Jesse, as you were talking about Isle Royale and some of those other surveys on these islands, you had mentioned how some areas had invasives and others did not. The question is, how does MNFI prevent the spread of invasive species in these high quality natural communities? Is it boot and shovel sanitation? Do you have protocols that you can share?
I had a hard time hearing you, but I think I heard, for some reason, it was it was a little bit muted.
Hey, Jesse.
Yeah.
Um, at the bottom of your screen, there's that Q&A
Ah,
symbol, so you can read the questions if that helps you out. Tony, I don't know what's going on with your audio, but we can kind of hear you.
RTAX. What's RTAX? Oh, is that from the never ending story? Okay. How does MNFI prevent the spread of invasive species? Right. So we clean off our boots, right? We use those boot scrapers, and then I do bleach. I do like a diluted bleach, and I'll just soak my shoes in there. And I also, because I go into some junky wetlands in southern Michigan, and so if I'm going to go into a place that has Phragmites or narrowleaf cattail, I have one set of boots for that, and I have another set that's for like I use my oldest kind of nastiest boots. Like I'm constantly cycling through boots, but I use my oldest nastiest boots for that, and I still sterilize those. But yeah, it's a challenge. You don't want to be how sad and tragic and ironic would it be for us to be the ones that ruin it. How do you decon your gear between well-used trails? Right. We have boot brushes, but we don't have bleach, so we just try to get it cleaned off as much as possible. Sometimes I use vinegar because that's a little easier to get sometimes. Josh Haw, you mentioned that MNFI maintains an invaluable database. How do we determine? I mean, we've really begun to redact reports that are available, at least for like federally endangered things and things that are facing high pressure from poachers, like Blanding's turtle, stuff like that. And so I don't know. I mean, I share freely with agencies, and I haven't operated with a real paranoia, and maybe I'm being naive. Like I don't think people are just reading our reports to look for where some of these species exist, but maybe that's naive. Um, I guess it just doesn't come up as much as it just doesn't seem to be an issue for most of it. But for the reptiles, Blanding's turtles, those are getting poached for Asian markets. Box turtles, same thing. And so I know there's been a lot of that getting redacted out for our federally endangered species. Our botany team has especially been redacting those. So moving forward, trying to give reports that protect that.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm going to read the next question here for you. One attendee asks, if vegetation is degraded or there's a high coverage of invasives, can that community still qualify as one of the natural communities in the MNFI key if all other indicators are met?
So, I mean, that is that Pentwater, Great Lakes Marsh, right? It was overwhelmingly dominated by the hybrid cattail or the invasive angustifolia. And, you know, at a certain point, it ends up being subjective. To be honest, I didn't know what to do. That had been in the system for a long time. They've tried invasive species control before. It clearly is providing important ecosystem services still. But like if I were to walk up on that cattail marsh right now, I would not put it in the database. And so should I have taken it out of the database? You know, it still had portions of high quality vegetation. I don't know. And so to dodge that, I just put it as a D. I tightened up the boundaries as best I could, and I explained the degradation. And I think if you know, future ecologists want to take it out of the database, at least they'll have sort of a chain of evidence supporting that that action. But like I didn't feel comfortable taking it out. And I think that's probably the best example, right? And but otherwise, no, we're like if we're not just putting degraded wetlands in the database, we try to be very Mike Cost would say we're paid to be ecological snobs. We don't want our database polluted with crap. And so it's our job to really try to focus on putting things that meet our standards, and we should be strict about those standards. And I try to be for the most part. But you see a system like the Great Lakes Marsh, they're super important for ecosystem services for all types of wildlife. I think that and they're not universally, but a lot of them have been extraordinarily degraded. So it's sort of like a system-wide crisis. And so instead of taking that one out, I kept it in the database and described sort of the degradation. So I'm rambling, but I feel like, you know, it's very complex and it's a really great question. And hopefully I gave you an answer that doesn't make you lose respect for me.
That's good. That's good. So another individual asks, what should we do if we think we have found a rare or imperiled wetland during a wetland delineation? Can MNFI provide feedback or review on the site?
I mean, you know, we're grant driven, and there's a lot of pressure not to just kind of do freebies, but at the same time, I think it's really important to weigh in. So I mean, you can send an email, you know, with pictures and do your best to sort of describe it and what type you think it is. So as long as you've kind of gone through what you think it is, and like, you know, really articulate some clear questions, I love it. I love it. I'm not going to do it every day of the week, but my God, that's what we're here for. So I would, you know, I think a lot of people would be happy to participate along those lines. So yeah, I mean, we do that for plants all the time. We have a survey 123 that people can download if they find rare plants. And so, yeah, we're taking information from folks all the time. And, you know, if you're out there doing wetland delineation and you know what you're seeing, if you send sort of a detailed description of the place with soils, we can add it to the database for sure, or we can help give feedback. But, you know, within reason. But yeah, I love that stuff.
Cool. Well, these are not questions, but folks want to let you know that this was one of the best webinars ever, containing a lot of good stuff that we don't usually get to see, and we appreciate your hard work. It's valuable work. So if anyone has a last minute question they want to squeeze in, go ahead and type it in the Q&A function. Otherwise, Tony and Jesse, I'll let you guys wrap this one up.
Can you hear me any better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jesse, for being here and presenting this. This is This is the second time I've gotten to hear Jesse present, and it's always one of the best times I get to have. So I really appreciate Jesse for making the time. And I'll add too, as a DNR employee, you know, when you have rare species accounts and you share them with MNFI, they benefit the DNR when we consider management or BMPs or really anything. So I highly encourage you to share that information if you get it. Otherwise, Jesse, do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to share to close up?
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate the extra time. Normally these, they're like, I'll keep it to 40 minutes. So I appreciate like giving a little extra leg room here. And thanks for the really kind compliments. It means a lot to me. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks for coming.